So let's take a look at the wide world importers. So I'll go ahead and expand that node there. And you can see all of the child nodes that give you some insight into all of the objects that are available within this database. Let me talk about a few of the database objects that you're likely to use most when you're working with a typical SQL Server database. The first one here is a database diagram. If I expand that, you can see that, first of all, I get this dialog box that says the database doesn't have one or more of the support objects required to use database diagramming. Do you wish to create them? So, because theoretically I now want to use database diagrams, I'll go ahead and click on Yes, and it'll take a few moments for SQL Server and Management Studio to add those objects. But then I can right-click on here and create a new database diagram. So I'm not going to run through everything right now, but essentially what this does, or lets you do, is include all of the different database tables that you want to include, as well as views and certain other features. And then it creates a nice GUI interface into the overall structure of the database. So basically what a database diagram does is it provides a graphical view of a set of tables and how they're related to each other with foreign key constraints. If you don't understand what a foreign key constraint is yet, don't worry about that. You'll learn about that later. But it's a way of relating two tables together in order to define the relationship between them, such as the relationship between customers and the orders that they've placed. The nice thing about database diagrams is that it's not just a view into the current structure of the database. You can also use the diagrams to make design changes to the tables. So as you're viewing the database diagram, you may notice that, oh, I forgot in the customer table I needed to include a particular field. You can add it directly within the database diagram rather than going into the definition of the table in order to create that in a separate place. The nice thing about diagrams is that they've become far more powerful and flexible in recent versions of SQL Server as databases have become more complex. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then tables. All of the data within a database is stored in tables. And each of those tables have a defined set of columns, indexes, and constraints. And if you drill down into this and the child nodes for each of these tables, then you can thoroughly explore the data objects within a database. So for example, if I look at sales.customer categories, I can drill down in here and look at a list of all of the columns or all of the fields, all of the bits of data that that particular table can store. And so you can explore that and you can look at the different data types of the different fields as well. So the primary key here is an integer, this is a string, this is another integer, and then it has a couple of date time values. Views are kind of interesting. What a view is essentially a saved query that selects data from one or more tables. So if you look at website.customers, that's some kind of view into the customer data that's apparently used by the website for this particular application. The nice thing about this is that by creating a view here within the database, it saves the query, the definition of that query that selects from one or more tables, what fields it includes, and so forth. And then I can execute queries against that view. And so that's a real handy way. If I'm constantly looking at the website customers, I can design a view that includes just the relevant fields for that view. And then from that view, then select data rather than going back to all of the source data. Maybe this view requires pulling data from 5 different tables. I don't know what the definition of this particular one is, but let's say that's the case. Then each time you write a query where you need to get a subset of that website customer data, you can go directly to this view rather than recreating a query that queries all 5 of those tables. Views are very cool, very powerful way to access your data. Okay, then another nice feature of databases is the different programming objects. And there's a number of different kinds of programming, essentially modules or chunks of code that you can define. One of the most important one is stored procedures. Now these are saved queries that can select data, kind of like views, but they can also make changes to the design or contents of tables. So they can actually change the data itself as well as the structure of the data, or even the structure of the database and server objects. And stored procedures, like any kind of, or most kinds of programming code, can have parameters and procedural code written either with Transact SQL, which is the query-based language of relational databases, or with a .NET language such as C#. Very, very powerful programming components that you can do some amazing things. And again, you can manipulate the data as well as the structure of, or the definition of that data. Another type of programming code that you can include within a database is functions. So SQL Server has built-in functions that you can call from your Transact SQL code. And you can create user-defined functions that take parameters and return data. They're just like functions in programming languages if you happen to be a software developer. And so you can either write these with using Transact SQL or a .NET language. And as you can see, there's several different types of functions that essentially return or perform different kinds of operations. So you have table-valued functions, and so there's just one within this wide world importers database. There's also scalar-valued functions, so the difference between these two types is that this returns rows and fields of data, essentially an in-memory table. This returns a single value of various data types. And then you can also define aggregate functions, which are constructs within SQL Server that'll let you aggregate data, such as finding the minimum or the maximum of a range of data, as well as calculate a sum, and so forth. So a lot of things that you can do with functions that are pretty cool. Okay, and then the last type of object that I want to point out is the security objects within a database. Now again, to emphasize, these are the security objects within the context of the database, not the server instance level of objects. There are server level security objects as well, but here I'm just pointing out the security objects of a database. So this is where you can define users and groups of users, which are called roles in SQL Server, in order to control access to various database objects. You can also create encryption keys in order to encrypt data saved in a table. SQL Server has some very robust features you can use to ensure the security and integrity of your data if you use them well and wisely. And so there's a lot to understand about the security features of SQL Server, and I'm not going to talk about those here. Now, as you've really begun to see, the Object Explorer in Management Studio is a window into the heart and soul of an instance of SQL Server. From it, you can access just about every database and server object, letting you perform just about any action on those objects. It really is well worth your time to get very familiar with this tool because you're likely to use them all the time as you work with an instance of SQL Server and its data and objects. Okay, so that's the Object Explorer. We can actually go a whole level deeper, and that's to explore the object details. So as you navigate a database and other objects in Object Explorer, you can view various details about whatever you currently have selected in the Object Explorer, and that's using the Object Details window. All right, it's not visible by default, so I can go up to the View menu here and select Object Explorer Details. Now in this case, I'm not worried about properties, so I'm going to hide that window there. By the way, Management Studio, because it's built using Visual Studio, has all of the features that you need to customize the workspace. And so you can hide windows, you can make them appear. So I just opened up a window using the View menu. I hid a window over here, the Properties window. If I wanted to look at it, I can click on it, and that opens that back up. And that'll show the properties of whatever I have selected over in another window here. And so it has a lot of flexibility. It's a highly customizable environment. Okay, so by default, when I open Object Explorer Details, it appears here in this larger area to the right. So I'm going to make that a little bit smaller so we can see more of the information with Object Explorer Details. Now the way this works is that the view and the list of objects in Object Explorer Details changes as you select different nodes in Object Explorer. So this makes it a really handy way to more deeply explore aspects of your SQL Server without necessarily drilling down into the object using Object Explorer. So in this case, because I have the security node of a particular database selected here within Object Explorer, this shows the different folders that are available within the security node. And I can drill down into these and display different kinds of information. Okay, so I'm going to come back up here to the Worldwide Importers database. And as you can see, that changes immediately to display the folders that are visible here as part of a database. And keep in mind again that you can install different features of SQL Server that then determine which subnodes here appear for database on the server level and so forth. Okay, so for a database, it really doesn't include all that much that's interesting. But if I go down into tables, this starts to get a little bit more interesting. Now I start to have some useful information about the tables in the database, including the creation date for each table. And as you can see, whoever created the Wide World Importers database for Microsoft created this table back in June of 2016 at 10:04 a.m. So quite a while ago. So by the way, keep in mind that if you download the current version of the sample databases, those dates and times may change, and there may be some small changes to the structure of the database as Microsoft adds additional features, updates the schema, and so forth for new features. Now, the default views for each object type have useful information. Again, for each of the nodes that I can select in Object Explorer, this default view has some useful information. By the way, this is a pristine installation of SQL Server 2016, a new installation of Management Studio. So what you're seeing at this point is all of the defaults that you're going to see when you do a new installation yourself. Okay, subject to Microsoft updating that a little bit over time. All right, so these default views include some basic information, but most of the views have actually a lot more information. So I right-clicked on this list of columns at the top of the view, and you can see that there's only 3 of these, well actually 4 of these fields that are selected. But most views have a lot of other options here that just aren't included within the default view. And in fact, some objects have many dozens of additional columns. So you can customize the Object Explorer details in order to provide the information that you find most useful. Okay, so one of the things that I find really useful is to add the row count column here. As you can see, it takes a moment to populate, but now this is displaying the number of rows in each of those tables. And by the way, one of the views or columns I don't find particularly interesting is the policy health state. That's definitely an advanced feature. It's very useful in some scenarios, but just for day-to-day operation, I don't find that all that useful. At least it's not worth taking up the space. So I deselected that and it gets rid of it. Okay, so I can see that the cities table has 37,940 rows. The payment methods only has 4. That kind of makes sense. There's a lot fewer payment methods available than cities in the world, and so forth. So this is really handy. One thing to keep in mind is that, remember that when I selected it, it took a couple seconds for it to populate. This is not a huge database. You know, there are 37,000 rows, there's 228,000 rows, but this really is not, you know, one of the larger databases that SQL Server has available. If it's really large, if there's a lot of tables, then it may take some serious time for that to populate. So try it on your database, and if it just takes forever for this view to appear because it has to go out and count all these rows in many tables, then you can always just turn it off if it's inconvenient. Because there's certainly lots of other ways to get the number of rows within an individual table. Okay, for another example, let's take a look at the databases node. So this is one level up from any of the user database or the system databases. Here, if I right-click on the column headers, notice that there are a lot of different fields. So if I scroll down here a bit, you need a pretty high-resolution monitor in order to be able to see all of those. You can see what a wealth of information is available about each of the databases here within this instance of SQL Server. So keep in mind that if I add any of these additional columns, that's going to appear for each of the databases within this database instance. By the way, if I right-click on this again and I go down to the bottom of the list of items, all of those right-click menus, when I click in the column headers, have this Reset View option down here. This is a fail-safe fallback option. And what it does is it restores the default view for that node. So feel free to experiment. Get wild, add whatever columns you want. If you notice that something just takes forever to populate, then just come down here, click the Reset View, and it'll get rid of your extra columns, add back any default columns, and you'll be good to start all over again. Okay, so that's becoming an increasingly common kind of a feature that Microsoft has added in appropriate context. Really nice to be able to feel free to experiment and go back to the default view. Okay, another really nice feature of Object Explorer's details is the ability to search for objects using that dialog box up there. The idea here is that a medium-sized database can easily have hundreds or thousands of objects, and large databases can have even more. And if there are several databases in an instance of SQL Server, the number is magnified even more. When you need to find a specific object, such as a specific code module with customer in the name, for example, finding a needle in the proverbial haystack can seem easy in comparison. It can be tedious to click around Object Explorer to find an object, particularly if you can't remember the first few letters of the object name. Sticking with a customer example, maybe the actual name of the object is Get Customers or Major Customers or something like that. But you can't remember what that first word is, and you kind of click around A, B, C in a long list of objects. It may take you a long time to find it. Because the problem, of course, is that it may have customer in the name, but it could start with any kind of characters. So that's where the object search box comes in handy. It's not actually part of the Object Explorer Details view, but is at the top of the view. That's that text box at the top. And what it does is it searches the entire context that is selected here within Object Explorer. So because I have the databases node selected, it's going to search across all databases. If I selected just a single database, then it's going to search within the context of just that database. So I'll come back up here to customers, and I'll go to the search box, and I'm going to type in %customer and %. What the % character is in this context is a wildcard characters, so that any number of characters can appear in the name before and after customer, including 0 characters. On the other hand, if I knew the exact name of the object, I don't have to add the wildcard characters. All right, so I'll hit enter, and it'll go out search, as you see, because I selected a bunch of databases, because I have the databases node selected. It took a few seconds for it to find all 76 instances of customer in an object name. Okay, so you can see that there's a customer category ID, customer key, and it identifies the type of object that it is. So this is a sequence. That's a particular construct of data within a SQL Server database. There are a few stored procedures. There are some indexes. This is a way of making queries against data on specific fields more efficient. And I can scroll down and a lot of indexes, and then you can start to see that there's some tables with customer in the name, some user-defined functions, and views. And it also identifies what schema this is part of. So indexes generally don't have schemas, but most other objects do. And then I have the path where it appears. And so if I double click on that and kind of minimize these a little bit and scroll over, I can see where exactly this is located. Now, this may look like a file path, but it's actually a hierarchical location of the data or of the object within the databases. So you can see this is the machine name, LearnNowOnline dev machine. The default databases, so it's located in different databases. This makes sense because I have the databases node selected there. And then it identifies the name of the database and then the folder, and this relates to the folders that are available within the database structure. Again, because I searched the context of databases. And so I can tell exactly where this is located. And then I can go directly to it and say I want to change it. So let me come back over here. These are stored procedures, insert customer orders. And then I can select that and get additional information about it. Okay, then I can come in here into World Wide Web Importers. I still have that search. It saves it in the box there. I'll hit enter again. And now it's going to search just within the context of the Wide World Importers database. And there you can see we got relatively fewer things. Previously, I didn't point out, but we had 76 matches. Now we only have 41 matches. And it has the same basic information. So again, because my search is narrower in scope, I get fewer objects. And of course, the number of objects is going to depend on the number of objects within this selected database that have this customer object. Now I went away from it, so I'll come back over here. Okay, so once again, that displays all of the objects with the customer in the name.